trying to build a business around changing consumers' behavior away from things that are deemed to be attractive, like meat eating, I think it's kind of a lost cause. I think we're better served to try and address the growing market, the growing demand, and try and help bring costs down. Unfortunately, the gatekeepers in the food system are industrial food companies. As you look at investment opportunities in this space, you definitely need some kind of an industrial connection in order to make these products work. I'm Kim Odhner. I'm a managing director of UNOVIS Asset Management based here in Amsterdam. I came over here about 8 years ago to set up our fund management business in Europe. We raised our second fund here in Europe, raised about 150 million euros. And I sit here together with the operations team focused on Europe and Asia. And I have three other partners in the United States, Chris Kerr, Dan Altschuler, and Mark Langley. Mark and Chris are based in New York, and Dan is based in San Francisco.
Well, Kim, I'm really excited about this conversation. I think when I saw I got a chance to speak to you, Novus, on this podcast, I said that you basically you're going to the root of all wisdom. One of the most experienced investors in the space who's been here for a long time. They saw a lot of the trends before they became trends, and also made a lot of bets. I think a lot of the other investors are kind of looking at it, thinking how they're going to play out. So we're going to be very excited about kind of going through where you're at this point, how the thesis evolved, and what's next. And where I want to start is just look at where you deployed cash recently, right? So there's 3 deployments that you've recently done as a follow-on investments into the space. And maybe we can talk to like what's making you comfortable around putting additional cash into these businesses? What's learnings have you gotten from other companies that you're applying here? And let's just start with Green Rebel Foods. Maybe, Kim, you could just give to our audience like a quick word about what the business is, and more importantly, why did you decide to make a follow-on bet?
Sure. Okay. So this may be sort of information that people already know, but essentially, if you look at a classic venture portfolio, let's say assuming maybe 20 deals in a portfolio, some percentage of those deals are not likely to succeed. Let's say, maybe out of 20, 5 won't make it. And then you'll have another 5 to 7 that'll bump along and do okay. And then there's 1, 2, or 3 that you have higher levels of conviction that continue to perform. And so those ones typically are the ones that you look to put money into. The other ones that you might look to put money into would be ones where you have sort of a downside risk. And so you put more money into to sort of hedge against that risk so that you don't have a loss, but it may not result in a significant upside. The ones that we're talking about today are essentially ones that we have optimism about. So we're hoping they will contribute to the performance of the fund. And by the way, that's fairly typical. So when you hear numbers about the number of companies that have failed in the marketplace, bear in mind, there was never an expectation that all of them would succeed. So, I mean, it's sort of understandable that there's going to be a significant number of losses given the number of companies that were invested in over the last cycle. So the company Green Rebel that you referred to is a company that's based in Indonesia. It's one of the early plant-based companies that was servicing the Southeast Asian market. Southeast Asia has been kind of an interesting place because on the one hand, non-animal proteins are not uncommon in Asia, particularly in Southeast Asia, things like tempeh, what they refer to as mock meats, tofu, certainly. These are products that have been known for, 1,000 years. So, so trying to break into that market with meat analogs is both interesting and at the same time, people understand them. And so there's a greater openness to them. Green Rebel was a particularly interesting company in the sense that it was domiciled not in Singapore, but in Indonesia. And Indonesia is a very, very large country, about 365 million people. And I like companies that serve a very large domestic community population. I'm also an investor in a company called Eura, a Spanish company, and it follows a very similar theme. The flavors, the formats, and things like that, they follow foods that are consumed locally. So people understand them, they can relate to the products that are being offered. Very similarly in Indonesia with Green Rebel, they were producing products that were understood in the marketplace. The flavors, the formats and so forth really followed the market. And so that's the starting point. Do you want to get a word in there?
Well, first of all, it's really interesting. And, I was on a trip to Singapore recently, and I was just looking at the map of the individual family earned income, right? Of that region of the Southeast, right? And I was like, okay, that's Singapore, like 100,000 per individual family. And then
Yeah.
Indonesia is one of the developing countries. It's highly populated, right? It's the most populated, I think, largest populated Muslim country in the world, I believe. But if you look at, say, the average income per family, per individual, it's still developing. I think it's something like in the 15, something like that.
Yeah.
So typically for those individuals, you start with a large population, but their income is still limited. So price is really, really going to be key to winning, right? Flavor,
Absolutely.
of course, is gonna be key on winning, but things like impact, sustainability, ethics, I think those are going to take a backseat most likely. Would that be correct? So, how
Yeah.
is Green Rebel winning in those categories, or are they just trying to focus on more the kind of the middle upper class of the country that has its own set of priorities?
Yeah. Good question. I think that one of the important things to consider is that, what market are we talking about? There's markets they've been quite successful in, and there's markets where they haven't performed as well. So if you look at retail, I mean, retail is sort of the holy grail and the one that we often think of because we're all sort of consumers of these products. Retail channels in Indonesia are fairly challenging, and it's because we don't have centralized retail in quite the same way that they do in the United States, for example, or in Europe, where you can get a centralized listing. And so through that centralized listing, you get it deployed in multiple stores at once. They tend to be more fragmented. Distribution is a bit more challenging, particularly in a country like Indonesia, where it's an archipelago with different islands and things like that. So the retail experience has been an interesting one, and it's been one that's, I think we've had a decent following in retail. But the bigger opportunities are really in food service. So where we've really gotten traction is in not only servicing things like QSRs. By QSRs, I mean, things like Starbucks, and various local QSRs, as well as regional IKEAs. So we provide a lot of the commissary services for IKEAs throughout the region. That's Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia. We also provide products on AirAsia. So in other words, the plant-based meals on AirAsia are produced by Green Rebel. Always like Sodexo, with some of the largest, let's say, competitors of Sodexo that service hotel chains and things like that as well. So those channels have been quite successful. And there's different types of products that we can sell into those channels, but our basic kind of meat analog products have performed quite well through those channels.
And then that food service play, who is the ideal client in that play? Is it moving individuals who are flexitarians into tasting more products, or you're focusing specifically on individuals who are looking for a vegan meat alternative, right? And they're choosing between tofu or this.
Yeah, good question. I mean, at the end of the day, the numbers, market to market, don't vary too much, around the world. So, in other words, the vegans represent a relatively small percentage of any target population. It seems the vegetarians, what you've got in Asia is you have many more people that follow sort of cultural norms or religious norms that have them eating, let's say, vegetarian food a couple times a month, or maybe for an entire month of the year, or things like that. So obviously they represent opportunities. The Buddhist community is quite massive in Asia, and they tend to eat allium free, and allium free is like garlic and ginger and things like that. Root vegetables, they tend to avoid those for religious reasons. The allium free customers don't tend to be so much of our target market. A lot of it is price driven. A lot of it is shelf stability, things like that. Meat is just not as prevalent, and particularly now when meat costs are going up, and where we found an additional market opportunity is through creating hybrid products. So we actually have produced what is essentially a texturized vegetable protein that's pre-texturized, pre-flavored, and it mixes very nicely with meat to extend meat and reduce price. And we do attempt in some markets to make health claims around those products. In other words, it's lower fat, it's lower in sodium, things like that. And those messages do resonate with certain populations.
It's funny you mentioned the Buddhists. I keep a kosher diet, so whenever I travel and I eat, I'm usually in a Jade or Buddhist temple kitchen. with my keeper there, just enjoying my my pho meat. Like a sushi restaurant afterwards. So I can definitely relate to that pain point and seeing that that could drive customers. And I like that actually what you mentioned is interesting about the hybrid model, which is something that more and more people are kind of embracing
Yeah.
as a path forward. Is the pain there that you essentially are cutting costs for a meat producer with your product? You're extending the meat solution to larger volume because it's going to typically be cheaper than what's in the market with, say, beef.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Every market is talking about sort of blended products and things like that today because it
Mhm.
represents a potential opportunity. One of the things is, the expectations, and quality of meat, let's say, and the way that meat is consumed, let's say in the West, makes it a little bit more challenging because I hope it's okay to say this. I mean, sort of a more sophisticated consumer around what meat, quality meat should taste like and things like that. So as a result, I think the experience that we've seen, at least here in the West, is that it's been a little bit more challenging to get consumers to embrace blended products. Whereas when you're looking at food service and things like that, I mean, I think depending on the application, you can cut the meat with something like a vegetable protein, and consumers are less, they notice it less. And so if you look at a market like Southeast Asia, consumers typically are not that accustomed to eating, let's say, a center of the plate piece of steak, for example. And so as a result, if they're eating a piece of meat that is a minced meat, for example, that minced meat could very easily be cut, and it probably wouldn't necessarily draw their attention. And also flavoring is another issue. Flavoring is fairly bold frequently, and so as a result, that flavoring kind of masks things like the soy taste or the pea protein taste that you would typically object to here in the West.
And it was Green Label like a deep tech solution, or was it just an execution play just gone really well for product market fit? Was there a deep IP in what they're doing? Or were you just impressed by how the team is just focusing on, margins, flavor, execution, understanding who their customers are, and just going ruthlessly after their consumers?
It's been trial and error. I mean, to suggest actually, or to say that that's been an easy business to scale is not accurate. It's been very challenging. And I think we've had to pivot along the way. Initially we were serving pretty much the entire Southeast Asian community. We were as far flung as the Philippines in the north. We were making products for the Korean market. We've made products for Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Vietnam, and what we've come to realize is that those products work in each and every one of those markets, particularly when they're adjusted to local flavors and formats. Our setup in Indonesia was very capable to produce those kinds of variations for each of those markets, and that made it quite interesting. But just the logistical cost of servicing kind of a broad Southeast Asian market has made it challenging. So we've pivoted, and we're much more focused. Maybe we continue to serve some of those markets, but we're very focused right now on the Indonesian market. And we're also looking more and more at what are some of the other protein products that people typically consume, that they understand, that they already know how to cook with and things like that. So we've broadened to focus on things like tempeh and shelf stable tofu. So we've made small innovations, particularly around the theme of shelf stability, using things like retort, so to actually create packages that are shelf stable. And in a market like Indonesia, where distribution is challenging and fresh product is more difficult to manage, shelf stability has really made a big difference.
Yeah. And I think to our listeners, the way I'm kind of projecting it through my end, we'll do some like marriage therapy here. You see if Kim, if I heard Kim, what I'm hearing from that is there's a problem with cold storage, essentially, right? So the cold storage supply chain is really under threat in that region. So if for a meat product spoil, right? It's a risk, right? So there's a larger risk when you're missing cold storage. So this is just a better solution for country that has a challenge with cold storage, freezing or refrigeration. A shelf stable product that can sit on the shelf, say 6 months, is just a better solution than a steak or a meat product, which which maybe from a taste profile maybe better, but from a risk standpoint with no cold storage, is much more risky. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's proven to be a successful recipe. I mean, at the end of the day, shelf stability, even here in the West, whether it's deli slices or chilled product in the chilled cabinet. I mean, shelf stability really leads to, if it's not consumed, it's ultimately waste, right?
Yeah.
The whole idea is that if you've got a fragmented distribution network and you've got shelf stability, then you're wasting less product. And I think that makes it so that actually even retailers and things, they're willing to try a product because it's shelf stable. They don't have to worry about whether or not it's going to go bad, and so they'll be willing to take a risk on it.
Okay, so with the Green Railway use case, like we're gonna summarize that one before we move to the next one. What I'm hearing is, look, Alex, with a tasty product that was in line with expectations of the current of that market, we know that part of what we need to evolve is we are limiting our geographical focus, right, to the markets that work the best. And we have identified that, hybrid shelf stabilization, religious preferences. This is where we're working. This is where we're winning, and we're gonna just double down on those pieces. What I'm not hearing is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is this notion of, look, meat eaters are going to stop eating meat. That's not part of that thesis. This product will replace meat eater consumption of meat. It's more about, hey, during the religious moments, they're going to do so because of cold storage, perhaps due to price rise. Those are the elements that are going to drive more consumption of our product.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, put it this way. I mean, I think at the end of the day, trying to build a business around, changing consumers' behavior away from things that are deemed to be attractive, like meat eating, I think it's kind of a lost cause. I think we're better served to try and address the growing market, the growing demand, and try and help bring costs down. And at the same time, where in certain applications where meat is not the central ingredient, where a meat analog can serve the purpose, then I think those are the applications where they tend to succeed. And I
Yeah.
think that's another important lesson. I mean, if you look at, one of our most successful products in Indonesia is a beef rendang product. The texture of our meat analog and the flavors and things like that, they're prepared flavors. You wouldn't even know the difference to taste it. I mean, you're not losing anything in that experience.
What is the sorry, beef rendang? What is that
Beef
application?
rendang is a local delicacy. It's like a form of curry,
Okay.
but it's a really tasty, kind of unique to Indonesia. It's something that they do very, very well, and it tastes wonderful.
But in that experience, like the sauce plays a very big role, right? It's
Sauce
a
plays an
sauce.
important role. The meat is also tenderized, right? So it's also sort of, let's say, softer and more fibrous in the way that plant-based can function nicely.
Okay.
And so, the whole experience is very similar to a meat eating experience.
I feel like everybody's stopping the podcast now and like ordering on DoorDash at this point. It's like, okay, they're
Oh,
just like, I have to figure out what the heck let's go to Indonesian restaurant next to my house, and I'm basically they'll thank you for that. Protein Brewery. Okay, so let's look at Protein Brewery. This is definitely one of my favorite entrepreneurs that I've interviewed him already twice on this podcast, and I love him very deeply and become a personal friend. What about that business made you feel confident? Was it the EFSA approval? Was it the fact that they had orders of customers who were ready to buy? Was it the trends of GLP-1s? What was about that business that made you feel like, okay, that's something we're willing to follow on?
I
Quick word from our sponsor, FTW Plus. Current fundraisers are taking 12 to 18 months. Runways are getting shorter, and founders are raising during one of the most difficult fundraising environments in history. They need more than a database. They need a bootcamp. FTW Plus is the digital bootcamp for agri-food founders who are actively raising. The most accurate investor database in the space. Pitch book at 1% of the price. Tiered warm introductions already built in, and complimentary one-on-one office hours as experts in deck design, scientific due diligence, and regulatory. And here's what FTW Plus is not. A broker taking a retainer and a cut of your raise. No percentage, no hidden fees. This is a membership community of venture-backed founders who are in the exact same trenches as you are. They back it with a guarantee. They work with you until you've booked 3 meetings with tier 1 investors, because in this market, you don't have time to waste on something that doesn't deliver. Go to foodtechweekly.com and join FTW Plus.
I think for the Protein Brewery, when we first invested in that company, let's say 5 years ago, 6 years ago. The thesis at the time was basically this company is going to produce a novel protein, a fungal protein that's going to replace soy or pea protein. So the focus was very much around meat analogs, and it was very kind of, let's say, consistent with where we made a lot of earlier investments. Over time, what we discovered is that product didn't really work in that application so well. And part of the reason why is because it's fibrous. It's got decent protein content, but it doesn't tend to bind very well. So we set about trying to figure out where do we have room to play with that product? And so over the course of the last, the few years, we've really focused on different applications. And what we've discovered is that there's a couple of things that product does very, very well. And one of them is it delivers really interesting micronutrients and nutritional profile for certain things that aren't readily found in other applications. And one of them, without spending too much time on all of them, one of them that's particularly interesting is something called spermidine. Spermidine is a kind of anti-aging ingredient that's most commonly found in wheat germ. And what we discovered is that 1 teaspoon of fermotine, which is our hero ingredient, is equivalent to 8 teaspoons of wheat germ. So in other words, it's very, very rich in this ingredient. And along with other sort of micronutrients, ingredients that serve sort of, the need for greater nutritional density and for active nutrition and for healthy aging and things like that, this product functions very, very well. And it also delivers protein and fiber. So it's what we've discovered and what we've kind of pivoted with this product is more toward the supplements.
Supplements, yeah.
So this ingredient actually functions nicely as a supplement ingredient. So that changes the price dynamics of that product significantly. So the product is much more valuable than what it originally was believed to be as a meat ingredient. And so as a result, it's a much more attractive company for follow-on investment purposes. And yes, of course, when you have regulatory approval, that's a real game changer. I mean, that means that we can sell it here in Europe as well as the United States. So that's the principal investment thesis behind that one.
And I think that works also very well with, and that lines up also similar to Alpine Bio as well, right? Where you had this move from evolution as the science evolved and you learn things, and then market also changed to find new applications. Can you talk about Alpine Bio?
Sure. Alpine Bio is quite an interesting company. I mean, we invested very early on. We kind of liked the thesis. We liked the idea of creating casein without the animal, so to speak. And Maggie, the CEO, has actually been effective in creating that casein business case. And so the product that she developed was one where casein is the protein in milk that is commonly used in cheese, and it's what gives cheese that wonderful stretch and things like that. And casein, she was able to, through molecular farming, which is essentially it's more or less GMO, but she's been able to get casein to express in soy. So soy becomes the bioreactor that helps to create that protein. She was not only able to get that to perform in the laboratory, but she's actually been able to do it sort of at a more farming scale. And we've actually grown it in field and produced product from that. The problem is that as people have started to pivot a little bit away from plant-based foods in the last, let's say, 18 months, the demand for plant-based casein has kind of declined a bit. So we've started to concentrate on something else that she's been working on, which is that in order to separate out that casein from the soy, there needs to be some kind of a wash. And that wash is the process is like an enzymatic wash. And in the process of exploring that, what we discovered is that washing process reduces some of the allergens that are currently found in soy. And it makes for a more medical grade, let's say, soy milk.
And it could be applied for what?
It's commonly used. It's a formula. But companies like Danone are very, very interested in this product because all of a sudden they can produce something that is high protein and it doesn't have the allergens.
Yeah, which anyone who's following the children formula space right now, they're definitely in need of a rebrand and the supply chain. Second look at supply chains. So that's
exactly. It's a very sensitive area, right? Because people want to know that their kids are, consuming things that are allergen free and things like that. So part of what we can do now is she can actually recreate the equivalent of like a soy milk, a liquid that is completely colorless. So not only can she strip out some of the allergens, she can even strip out the coloring.
Wow.
It's pretty impressive, and that's unique. And I think it's gotten a lot of interest. And she's also, along the way, she's also been able to create some higher value ingredients that are also really in demand right now. One of them being lactoferrin, for example, which is also pharma.
Perfect. All right. So this is really interesting in the sense, again, this is another play of moving where the market is moving, where the science is moving. And each one of these examples is really something that each one of our clients, each one of our listeners can learn from. Are there other themes that you feel very passionate about as an investor who's been playing the last, while, and one of the original investors in the space, how evolution of your thoughts as an investor has changed looking forward for the next 18 to 24 months? Where do you see, what you believe as an investor can give outsized returns for investors?
I think a lot of investors that came into the space, and a lot of people that actually raised money to try and invest in this space. I mean, I think let's say most came with good intentions and the expectation that we were going to see returns relatively quickly, particularly in food tech investments because of the tech attachment. The reality is that food is something that evolves very slowly, and typically consumers directly don't make calls about ingredients, for example. That's something that industry sort of refines and presents scalable and cost effective ways that consumers ultimately, let's say, benefit from. I think one of the things that I would encourage people to continue to think about is that our food system today is still under stress. We're trying to produce more with a system that really is not designed to continue to produce at the levels that we're going to need it to produce at going forward. And so there's still tremendous opportunity to invest in the food system. The question is how and where, at what stages, and who ultimately decides what gets used and what doesn't get used. And I think that's where I would encourage people to look more at. Unfortunately, the gatekeepers in the food system are industrial food companies. I mean, they're the ones that know how to take those ingredients and deploy them in recurring fashions in the food system. And so as you look at investment opportunities in this space, I mean, you definitely need some kind of an industrial connection in order to make these products work.
Uh, so reading between the lines, that means that when they talk about disrupting the food system, it's going to be very hard to disrupt Nestle. It's going to be very hard to disrupt Unilever. It's not like a piece of software that can then essentially, like an AI solution, disrupt SaaS. Right now, you could build your own SaaS. It's going to be very difficult for you to create a whole manufacturing system of feeding 9 billion people. That's quite a big. You might be able to feed people with software through a Lovable or Anthropic, but to do the same thing for physical good like food, you're going to have to play with existing players. There's no going around. They're the gatekeepers. Would that be accurate?
For sure. I think that's a really good point, Alex. And I think, that's not to say that we won't see new food companies pop up, but a lot of new food companies, if you will, are companies that are sort of spin outs or, companies that had formerly been part of a larger enterprise and that were then spun out to operate independently, things like that. And so and in so doing, they become more specialized, more focused on what they're doing. And as a result, maybe they're in a better position to look at and absorb new technologies or new ways of producing products or even new ingredients and things like that. But a lot of these big sort of CPG companies as we know them today, the Crafts of the world, the Yum Foods of the world, the Nestle's, all Unilevers, all these companies are sort of reevaluating how they do business today because their relationship with consumers has actually kind of fallen down. They're not reaching consumers in the way that they used to. And I think that's where more nimble companies are better able to sort of understand what the market's looking for and address those needs. But to recreate a food company from scratch, I think that's a tough one.
Kim, for those who are listening, and want to give back for the wisdom you shared, what are you looking for in the next 12 to 12 months? If I'm a listener and I want to say thank you, I want to reach out. What should I be reaching out for? What will be the next step after I listen to this podcast?
No, I appreciate it, Alex. I mean, we're just about to launch a new fund, and that new fund is really going to be growth focused. It's going to look a little bit more broad at the food system. By broad, what I mean is, historically we've been very focused on the alternative protein space. We're looking a little bit broader at ingredients because I think functional ingredients, healthy ingredients, the way that these ingredients are produced, those are all really important issues to sort of look at. And obviously, how that fits into the food system is really dependent on some of the industrial players that are already operating in that space. So I wouldn't necessarily build a fund and focus my entire efforts around big CPG companies. If I'm right in my thesis, then I think where the real opportunities lie are in some of the more nimble, maybe spin outs from some of the larger companies that are really looking more specifically at some of the areas where change can happen and change can happen quickly.
And those spinouts would have an independent balance sheet, independent. They just have these corporates might have an equity position in the company, right? But they're
Yeah.
independent businesses.
Yeah. I mean, what you're really seeing, I mean,
Be like a
just
DVG, something like that, which is a spin out of DSM and Fintera.
yeah, something like that. I mean, that's well and truly a startup. But I guess what I'm thinking more is if you look at how companies are starting to sort of separate out today, you're seeing more of these big ingredient players. So you're looking at companies that have kind of repositioned themselves as ingredient players. So they're looking more at the strategic sides of food production, and they can work more closely with let's say they're a little bit more asset light than the companies from which they originated. So to work with those folks, I mean, they're in a better position to know how to take ingredients and deploy them and where, if you know
So
what I
would
mean.
that be like a Magnum spinning out of Unilever, or was Magnum too big?
Actually, a lot of companies have kind of repositioned themselves as ingredient players. You look at ADM, for example,
Yeah.
ADM is rebranding itself effectively as an ingredient play. And they're divesting themselves of some of their, sort of legacy industries that are a little bit more asset heavy, that are more, sort of industrial. DSM Firmenich, and DSM was originally a mining company, and it acquired Firmenich as an asset, and so now it's repositioned itself effectively as a more of an ingredient player. It's not to say they don't still have some of those heavy assets, but actually what they're trying to do is sort of leverage their ability to work across the food system and find, different ways to work with some of the food producers to deliver solutions and things like that. So you need to work with those kinds of folks because they are the ones that are actually out there talking with food producers, deploy innovation into some of those legacy food producers.
Kim, I think you've given us a lot of food for thought in this conversation. And thank you so much for being one of the leaders in the space and paving the way for so much innovation that's happened. But exciting to see the next stage of the innovation take place over the next 12 to 18 months.
Well, thanks very much, Alex. I really appreciate the time. It's been an interesting conversation.
One more thing, don't close this episode yet. If you got value from this conversation, here's what I need from you. A 5-star rating, one comment, 20 seconds of your time. That's the deal. A 5-star rating means more founders find this content, and every time a founder raises, all boats are elevated. Every week, I pick one random comment and send that person a complimentary copy of Investment Climate, the book. 50 sales playbooks from founders who actually raise money during the fundraising winter. Real strategies, real closes, real numbers, not theory. So if you want a copy, comment below, and if you haven't followed the show yet, do that too. And if there's a guest you want us to bring on the show, just drop us a note or send us an email. We'll read each and every one. Until then, keep on raising.